We were last talking about the various girls who worked for our parents as maids. They stayed right at the home. We are going to mention some of the names of these people. Now, in certain cases, I don't recall the first name, but I remember the family name. One of the families was a girl by the name of Arlt. She was from the Hawks area, and she married a Jack Leiber. And might say something about that. She had probably about 5 kids. I had most of them in high school. And Teresa, you'll be interested in this, that one of their daughters, named Mickey Kleiber, was an employee of the United States State Department. And during the time, I believe, that you and John were on your tour of India and Nepal, she was stationed at Kathmandu in the embassy. Isn't that interesting? Now, another one of those girls was an Urlaub girl. And she married a fellow here from Dalma named Ed Ratke. They had a daughter also that was in high school. Then there was Hannah Turner, who was my next door neighbor here for many years. She married an Andy Tischler, and she had 3 girls. She had a couple girls and a boy. And Hannah's still living. She lives in a home for the elderly out here on the highway. Then there was a girl named Emma Raske. She married a Leonard Polk. There was also a girl named Bertha Hardis, who was one of our relatives. She married a man named Herman Zinke, and she had 3 boys, and they had those in school. Then the last one that I recall was a girl from Germany named Frieda Lorke. Now, Frieda come over here, sponsored by, I believe, the Lipke family from Metz, and she worked for the folks for several years, and then she finally left and married a man from Benton Harbor of the name of Fisher. And she used to come up here for many years and visit with Mother. Now, there are other, of course, people in town that had these girls on a live-in basis, where they had families and these girls came into work. Most of these girls were probably between ages of 16 and 20. Now, in the 1920s, we had a small hospital here, the private hospital run by Dr. Sam Rutledge. There were other doctors in town here, of course, that you will remember, that probably treated you. There was a Dr. Nestor, there was a Dr. Monroe, a Dr. Arscott, a Dr. Lark. Now, we did not have a Rogers City Hospital until about 1951. That remained in operation for about 40 years and finally closed about financial reasons. They just could not make it. That's happened to many small hospitals in northern Michigan. Today, you have to go to a hospital in Alpena or Petoskey or Sheboygan. We have good service. Now, the extended care facility where a mother was closed for a period of a couple of years and now has reopened, and the extended care facility is full of people again and probably will be expanded. The old hospital has been taken over by Alpena Hospital, and they run a series of doctors in here every day, and we have regular doctors for regular service, and there's physical therapy department, and there's also rehabilitation, and there are consulting physicians that come in here, and if they can't treat you, they send you out to Alpena by ambulance or by your own car. So it's similar to what we had previous to the time that we had a private hospital here. There are other items that come to mind about the period of the mid-20s that I can think of right now. I wonder whatever happened to that large cowhide black robe that had made, especially for riding in the open cars. It used to be always in the cars at that time. I recall the family in the fall of the year, late summer, going out to Lake May to pick huckleberries, or to go out to the pines in the Minnetonka area to pick huckleberries, or go up to the Black Lake area to pick blackberries. I remember gathering wild hazelnuts near the quarry across from the Gilpin football field, was now the Gilpin football field. And I remember that there was a small grove of those wild hickory or hazelnuts that grew next to the ice house, which was on the Osgood property. There were some homes at that time, the Osgoods were one, the Ewells were other, that had small ice houses where people stored ice for the summer season, that ice coming out of the Little Lake area. With the fishing that went on down here at the local harbor, the big fishery of trout and whitefish, of course, those fellas in the spring, summer, fall seasons had to have large quantities of ice on hand to ship their loads of fish out by train. The fish would come in here, they would be cleaned, and then packed in ice in boxes, fish boxes. And they'd be loaded on trains, on the train, and they went out, packed in ice, and got them to the markets in Bay City, Saginaw, Flint, and Detroit overnight. I also wonder if that you will recall about the Simons Farm, which was on the edge of town, where later on the community of Petersville was built. The Simons was a regular farm owned by a family named Simons, and one of the girls married a fellow by the name of Peters. They operated the farm for a little while, and then they decided to divide the farm up into lots to sell to fellows who were working at the plant, who wanted land to build homes on. And at one time, there were probably 25, 30, maybe 40 homes were in the area what we call Petersville. You recall that area, just outside of town here to the south. Today, it is no more. You drive by there today, it's nothing but a hole in the ground. That whole community, including its streets and the village store, gas station, everything is gone. Nothing but a big hole in the ground. That wasn't an incorporated village. It was just a village outside of the in the township of Rogers. And there's nothing left there today at all that you will recall. Now, you recall that in the living room of our old home there on 3rd Street, there was a bookcase, probably 6 inches wide and 10 inches deep and probably about 6 feet high. And that was the library, you might say, that Mother and Dad had accumulated. And I recall some of the books that were in that library area, in the bookcase area. There was a book by Kazan, I remember. There was a book of Billy Whiskers. The author was Elizabeth Montgomery. Now, Elizabeth Montgomery was a well-known national author who did some of her writing up here in Rogers City, and she was a well-known resident in the early days. And the Billy Whiskers stories were very, very popular at that time. And in fact, I've read where President John Kennedy, as a young man, enjoyed reading the Billy Whiskers stories. Then there were books written by the famous Western author Zane Grey. I remember one of the books called Riders of the Purple Sage. There were a book for girls known as the Bobbsey Twins, a book for boys known as the Rover Boys. There was a 15-volume set of the Book of Knowledge, and there were some of Dad's college books from Central Michigan and Ferris Institute that he attended at the turn of the century. There were such books as spelling, orthography, writing, story writing, poetry, philosophy, anatomy, mathematics, accounting. There was also a book entitled The Life of Martin Luther King, not Martin Luther King, but Martin Luther, the religious leader. And there was a copy of Luther's Catechism, which we all used. Mother, as you recall, played the old pump organ, and later the piano. Dad played the accordion, and could also play the old pump organ. Now that old pump organ, after the folks got a modern piano, was given to the St. Peter's Lutheran Church in Metz. And you wonder what happened to it now. I don't know. Then I wonder what happened to Herman's violin. Brother Herman was a pretty good violinist. In fact, that he played at quite a few of the old assemblies that we had in the old high school. Now, I'm not talking about the high school you and I graduated from. I'm talking about the old high school, the old red brick. I used to play for assemblies there. I took violin lessons for a while because every kid in the family was supposed to learn how to play some musical instrument. I took lessons, violin lessons, from a man known as Professor Beauregard. Well, for some reason or other, Professor Beauregard and I didn't agree on a lot of things, so we changed over and I took violin lessons from an Otto Steffen. He's one of the Steffen boys that lived over in the corner, just a block from our house. Well, I finally gave up on that, and then I took, for probably 4 or 5 years, I took piano lessons from a Lorraine Lendorf Hoffman. And then I finally ended up by playing a saxophone. Dad bought me an E-flat alto king saxophone. I'd learned to play in what was called the first high school band. It wasn't a band for credit. A fellow by the name of Davis was the leader of the city band, and he needed a feeder system for the city band. And so he rounded up some old instruments, got 15, 20, or 30 fellows together, and we proceeded to form a band by playing after schools and practicing evenings, and did play for a couple of assemblies. I played the saxophone and persuaded Dad to get me a new one. Well, I got the new one and was doing pretty good, except that come the fall of 1930, I was off to college, to Michigan State. The saxophone stayed home. Well, after about a year of staying home, Dad said, "What do you want to do with that sax?" He said, "If you don't want it, I'll sell it." I said, "Sell it." So it was sold. But it's still in the same family ad that bought it at that time. So that ended my musical career. I think all the kids in the family took a certain amount of lessons. I know George took some piano lessons. I think Ernestine did. I don't know about Therese and George. I think George did too for a while. But nevertheless, music was a part of life at that time. And now, as far as the city band was concerned, as I mentioned before, a lot of the kids that learned to play musical instruments at that time, in the area around 28, 29, 30, went on and played in the city band, and they also played in the dance bands around town at that time. One of the more famous dance bands at that time around town was a group known as the Blue and White Orchestra. And that was around here for a period probably about 30 or 35 years. Now, I also recall that the period of the silent movies, before the talkies came in the late 20s, 27, 28, 29. When you went to the movies before that time, the movies were silent. But practically every movie house in the country had a piano where a certain individual played. The music that they played was according to the show that was on. If there was a war scene, you got a lot of thunder and lightning played on the piano. But it was interesting. Now, there are a lot of people in town who played the... Now, what happened there was that because it didn't make any difference that the piano was playing, because the movie was silent anyway. As long as you could read, the story was told on the film. And but some of the people I remember that played the piano in the old Star Theater were people like Elsie Teeters, Genevieve Raines, Josie Schutz Valentine, Ruth Adams Hamilton, Lorraine Huffman, Lorraine Lendorf Huffman, and Lena Bertram, and many others. Most of these, of course, people were also teaching piano on the side. But it was just an interesting part of the life of those days. Other thoughts as I go back in time about the family and home on 3rd Street. I often wonder what happened to Dad's accordion. When I drive past the old home the other day, this is just the other day, July of 95, I see some of the old Caragana shrubbery still growing along the back driveway and next to the old barn garage. Now, Dad and Mother brought those plants back from one of their trips to North Dakota, about 1928 or 29. Dad went out there for the bank to check property about which loans had been made years before by Mr. C.H. Osgood. Osgood had loaned money to these people that had gone out there because he knew them. They bought land out there and proceeded to farm. But as it turned out, those were good loans. Dad said they were paid off in time, but periodically they went out just to take a look. And a couple of the times, Mother and Dad took the old car and out they went, out to North Dakota. By the way, still today, 1995, I keep in touch with the Yule boys who live in the Los Angeles area. When I was a kid, that Yule family built right next door. You recall the Anderson Hill House. They had 3 boys, Paul, Bob, and Henry. They left about 1919, 1920. Their mother was a daughter of P.H. Heft. Her name was Edna. Now, Paul today is about 85. Bob is dead, and Hank is about 80. We've kept in touch over the years, and I recently talked to Hank by phone. I haven't seen him in 75 years. The last time I saw Paul was about 1929. He was here in Rogers City. Reminds me of a movie called Somewhere in Time. Now, a little more about the Yule boys, just for the record. Paul and Bob got in on the ground floor of the movies business in Los Angeles, where they lived, as photographers. Bob was the photographer for the movie The Anatomy of a Murder, made in Marquette and Big Boy, Michigan, up here in the UP. That starred Jimmy Stewart and other famous people. He worked for a director, Bob did, for the director of that movie was Otto Preminger. Now, the man who did the movie Somewhere in Time was made on Mackinac Island. The star was Esther Williams in that famous swim scene on the pool at Mackinac Island Grand Hotel. It was a movie about the early days of that fabulous Mackinac Island resort. Paul also, by the way, did a lot of work in television. He was a photographer, and his credits appear there on the Mary Tyler Moore Show. He was the photographer for the Bob Newhart Show. If you see reruns of that movie, you'll see where he gets these credits there. Those kids made it big, and I'm proud of them for their connection to Rogers City. I remember the first radio that we had, about 1924-25. Herman and I bought a kit from Frank Reinke, who was one of the local electricians and very much up on radio. We put the kit together per instructions. Some parts were handmade, according to the sketches. Dad bought a car battery, and by gosh, it worked. We used headphones, but it brought in KDDA in Pittsburgh and WJR in Detroit. Now, you had to have headphones. Not too long after that, the radio sets started to come in, and Dad bought the first set, probably about 3 foot high and maybe about 20 inches wide, 10 inches deep. It was an Atwater Kent, but it had a speaker on it. So anybody, you didn't have to have 4 or 5 headsets attached to it. What a wonderful era that came into our lives at that time. The era of the radio. Hi. Today, I'll talk about a variety of things. Not necessarily about 1926 or 27. But today is August 29th, 1995. It's kind of a sunny day outside this morning. Temperature about 70 degrees here in Rogers City, Michigan. As I say, about a variety of things I thought maybe just jot down just for your general information. I'm going to start by talking about the year about 1940 and 42. At that time, all the kids were gone, and Dad, Mother, and I mostly occupied the house. I was teaching. I was still single, and Dad and I spent a lot of time after work hunting and fishing in both the spring and fall and summer of the year. I, of course, Dad loved to trout fish, and of course so did I. And oftentimes at breakfast we'd say, well, what are we going to do after work today? And he'd say, well, let's try the trout fishing. And so we would decide whether we would go to the Upper Trout River, which was in Rogers Township, or go to Silver Creek, or go to the Little Akiak. And after coming home from school, Dad from the bank, we'd hurry up, change clothes, grab a bite to eat, and get some worms out of the boxes of worms that we always had stored in the garage in dynamite boxes, grab the dog kazan, and away we would go. We used to have a lot of fun. Sometimes we'd fish and get nothing, other times we'd fish and we would hit the jackpot. I remember in the summer of 42, just before I got married in August, that one time Dad and I hit the jackpot on the fishing brown trout on the Big Akiak. There were several. We fished the browns at night, and we would go and just before dark get to several big holes that we knew about on the Akiak below the falls, and took our camp stools along, and got there just before dark set in. And these were good-sized holes, and we'd probably fish maybe about 10 yards apart, something like that. And we fished with light lines, unweighted, and just threw the lines in and let the currents take the bait wherever it wanted to go. And this is always intriguing, fishing at night along that area, because, of course, the woods were full of animals. There were a lot of deer around, and every once in a while they'd scare the bejapers out of you because they would snort, they would smell you, they would stomp their feet, and when they snorted, it would kind of jar you a little bit because it means that they were winding you. Now, I remember this one night we hit it. We got our limit. 10 great, big, beautiful browns, each one of us, 20 fish. These were fish in the size probably anywhere from 10 to 15 inches long. Great, big, deep, beautiful fish, probably weighed a pound or pound and a half apiece. And we got those in a matter of probably about 2 hours. I would say that probably by 11 o'clock in the evening, and we were on our way home. And came home, cleaned the fish, these great, big, beautiful fish. And, of course, it was too late to distribute them. So the next day, I had a job of taking some of these fish, 2 or 3, to some of the neighbors, the Bertrams, the Valentines, the Chabellas, the Hillas, the Hammonds, and we just gave them away. Why did we give them away? Well, Dad usually fished 2 or 3 times a week, and he was a good trout fisherman. And Mother said there were just too many fish in the freezer, and you shouldn't keep fish any more than a week anyway, so we gave them away. And so that was one of the very best fishing expeditions with Dad that I ever recall, fishing at brown trout at night on the Akiak River. Other ramblings. I recall that when all six of us were home again getting back at breakfast time, Herb and I would get up earlier because the high school started at 8:05 in the morning, and the grade schools didn't start until 9 o'clock. So after we had breakfast out of the way, Dad, Mother, and Herb and I, Dad would get the dog, go over to the upstairs door, open it up and say to the dog, go up and get him. Well, the dog would bound upstairs, and he'd get into the girls' room, jump on the bed, lick him across the face. Well, that really got him up, of course. And now, the thing is that in the girls' room, as you remember upstairs, the chimney from the basement ran right straight through that room. A little bit unusual, but the chimney had to go someplace, and that chimney was right there in the middle of that big, beautiful room where the two big twin beds. And that was plastered. But one nice thing about it in the wintertime is that chimney was warm. The girls got up, they could put their backs against that warm chimney. It was a nice place to get dressed. And then there are other things that are called other ramblings. And I happened to think of it the other day when I was sitting here eating some brown bread that my neighbor had brought in, or graham or whole wheat bread, that every fall of the year, Dad would get a couple 100 pounds of grain from the co-op, wheat, and we take that wheat out many times to Ilusky's mill at Posen, where it would be ground into wheat flour. And quite often that they would grind that wheat right then and there if you got out there at the right time. Other times you probably had to wait a little bit. If you waited a little bit, you could go down to the river just below the dam and fish for bullheads. Sometimes you had to, of course, come back in a week to get the flour because you had too much ahead. But I often remember that quite often when we did that on the way back, we would stop, Dad and I would stop at one of the taverns, the Flying Duck Tavern, or the Higginsville Tavern, or the Deer Hunt Inn to have a beer. And then there were other times Dad and I would be fishing for bullheads at Lake Nettie, or we're fishing for black bass at Lost Lake, and bullheads also. And we fished there quite frequently. Dad belonged to what was called the Spitzer Club at Lake Nettie, which was a social organization, as you recall. And they not only had a building there that they used for social purposes, but they also had a boathouse where 4 or 5 boats were stored, and any of the members could go and use the boats anytime that they wanted to. And it was there that we quite frequently would go and fish for bullheads. And Dad also loved that sport. Now, Dad and I did a certain amount of rabbit hunting in the fall of the year and a certain amount of partridge hunting. He liked to go out to the Old Metz area and hunt on some of the Drambert property. One of the places he loved to hunt was at 40 acres of land where it was over there near Uncle Otto's, and that's where that big pine tree stood that became a part of the folks' home, our home there in Rogers City. And now at Lake Nettie, Mother and Dad owned about 100 acres of land, about 3/8 of a mile of frontage on Lost Lake itself. And that's where I did practically all of my deer hunting over some 40-year period, starting from about 1935 to about 1975. I hunted deer there almost every fall. And in that period of time, I figure deer as I could count, I kept track of it for years, I got 19 deer. One year I got 3. And and also, I might say, as on the Lost Lake area, that on that 100 acres of land, in 1956, that's where Dad shot that one deer in his later years, 1956. He hadn't shot a deer since he was about 14 years old in Metz. I recounted that in one of the earlier periods. But I was with him that morning when we hunted Lost Lake, and he got a nice big 6 or 8 point buck. I was with him probably only about 50 yards away from him over another ridge when he shot that deer. That was a wonderful day for Dad. And you recall he had a photo of that made, and he sent it out as a Christmas card in the Christmas of 1956. I, of course, also spent a lot of time in the early years, starting probably from about age 14 on or 13 on, duck hunting. I love to hunt ducks. I got started to hunt ducks with my friend Lyman Polk that I hunted with for almost 50 years. We used to hunt a lot at Swan Lake. We hunted Adams Point. We hunted Lake Nettie. We hunted Lake Louise. We hunted Lake Emma. We hunted Lake Ella. We hunted the Akiak River. And I got so that I was pretty good at it. I did also a lot of duck hunting on Lost Lake. And along the shore here at Seagull Point was a good place to throw in decoys. And also up along the lake, all past Akiak. And now, Lyman Polk, of course, and I were great fishing and hunting friends from probably about when I got to be in about the 7th grade. He was an excellent outdoorsman and, of course, lived his entire life in the Lake Nettie and Lake Louise area, where he had several homes built at Lake Louise and also at Lake Nettie. And he married Dorothy Caldwell, and they ran Polk's Lodge, which was a very, very successful economic operation, where they, between the two of them, they owned probably about 7 or 8 or 9 cabins, which they rented out to hunters and to fishermen. And he acted as a guide for those people that came up from down below, and it was a very successful venture. She did the cooking for the camp and was an excellent cook. Now,